Welcome to the third episode of our iSense Q&A series. I am Erin Manning, the Communications Officer for iSense, an EPSRC-funded interdisciplinary research collaboration. Our researchers are working to develop tools and technologies to track, test and treat infectious diseases. This Q&A series is a chance to speak to and learn from experts working in fields related to infectious disease surveillance, testing, treatment and beyond. Today we're speaking to Professor Eleni Nastouli from University College London Hospital and Professor Michael Edelstein from Bar Ilan University in Israel on the topic, is herd immunity a reality?
Thank you. So I'm a clinical virologist at UCLH and UCL and dealing with COVID a lot since February, March. Both on the clinical front, but also involved in research, and recently moved to the Crick Institute, where we have been doing a few research projects on COVID.
Thanks, Eleni. Thanks for joining us. And Michael, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Michael Edelstein. I'm an infectious disease epidemiologist by background, and I'm a professor of public health at Bar Ilan University in Israel. Previously, I was in the immunization division at Public Health England, which is how I got to know Erin. And like everyone else working in infectious disease epidemiology, I'm being completely rediverted to COVID-19. Particularly in my previous role at PHE on community surveillance of COVID-19, and now looking at several aspects of the pandemic, including future acceptance of a vaccine, as well as long-term impacts, both direct and indirect, of the virus.
Great, thank you for joining us, Michael, and thanks for that introduction. So the first question I wanted to ask both of you is a very overarching question on the topic, and that is, what is herd immunity and how does it happen in theory? Maybe Michael, would you like to start?
Sure. So I think the term herd immunity is well understood in the community of public health and epidemiology, but perhaps less well understood, or I think it's been misused. Herd immunity is essentially an epidemiological concept, which is that once a proportion of the population is immune to a particular pathogen, a virus or a bacteria, the pathogen stops circulating, because those who are protected are directly protected, so they've developed the immunity, and they're also indirectly protecting those who are not yet, those who are still susceptible. So there's just not enough people who are susceptible within a population to enable the pathogen to spread. When people have talked about a herd immunity strategy in COVID, what they've talked about is something completely different, which is a deliberate policy to let people, in the absence of a vaccine, because you can become immune through natural immunity, i.e., being infected, or through vaccination, or through other artificial means as well, like, for example, immunoglobulin. But the bottom line is you can either get natural infection or you can get an intervention that will stop it. The idea is that in an absence of a vaccine, you let people get infected as a strategy isn't herd immunity. It's just a deliberate policy to try to achieve that, and it's a very different proposal to what herd immunity is, which is just an epidemiological concept. It's not an approach to managing outbreaks. So I think it's important to understand that, and vaccination would be a more classical way and safer way to reach herd immunity in a population.
Great, thank you, Michael. Eleni, do you have anything to add?
Yes, just very quickly, I 100% agree with this. And I think what is interesting in this pandemic, and I'm sure there will be a lot of papers and books maybe about it, is the use of terms and concepts and notions in a very different way. And coming from my, from my pediatric background, if you like, herd immunity is a term that has always been used in the context of vaccination. I have never heard before the pandemic, I don't know about you, Michael, talking about herd immunity in terms of natural infection only. I mean, this is something we use in pediatrics in the context of vaccination, and what that vaccination coverage you need in order to achieve that herd immunity in the population. It's always linked to vaccination. So I think in this pandemic, we have seen the use of these terms, of some terms, outside their usual context. And I think that is a very interesting behavior, if you like, that probably needs more analysis. And yes, I agree with you. I don't think that a policy like that, actually, we have evidence now that it doesn't work. If you look at the example of Sweden, or the epidemic in Manaus, for example, where it was expected that a lot less people will be infected in the subsequent wave, but this actually didn't happen.
Yeah, just to add one little point, I think we need to distinguish because the Swedish example gets talked about quite a lot. I don't think that the Swedish policy was necessarily to explicitly, the only country, as far as I know, that specifically and explicitly said we're going to try and control this outbreak by letting people getting infected is the UK. But they very quickly retracted. In Sweden, I think what they try to achieve is not necessarily that. It's more to, what I would call to live with the virus, to keep, to try and strike a balance between continuing life as normal as possible, while accepting that there will be a cost to that in terms of cases, morbidity and mortality, but keeping that under control, which is slightly different to a policy of deliberately getting people infected, which is unethical and not effective, and actually not feasible. And I can go into why if you want.
I guess if the vaccination rolls out, what proportion of the population would need to get the vaccination in order to gain herd immunity through vaccination? Eleni, maybe you'd like to comment on that?
Well, I mean, Michael can correct me if I'm wrong here, but I guess we are considering something like 60 to 90%. So I guess it will sit around 70 to 80%. I guess, which is similar. Yeah, I don't know if Michael has a different view on this.
No, I think the range sounds about right, but I just want to bring a little element of precision, which is that the herd immunity is the proportion of the population who needs to be immune, which is slightly different from the proportion that needs to be vaccinated. Because I mean, I know that the early results from the trials are very encouraging, and you will all have seen that. 95% protection, which is fantastic. These are actually efficacy in trials, which is slightly different from effectiveness in real life. This is relying on 2 doses. Some people will forget the second dose. It relies on cold chain at -80 degrees, which almost certainly there'll be breaches. So you probably need to aim for a slightly higher proportion of people vaccinated that you want to achieve in terms of herd immunity. Now, what you need to achieve for herd immunity is directly dependent on how transmissible the virus is. The viruses that are very transmissible, like measles, for example, you need very, very high levels of protection in the order of 95%. With something like COVID, which seems to have an R around 2.5 or so, although there's some nuance into that, you're probably looking at 60 to 70%. So herd immunity, so proportion immune, which probably means in reality about 80-85%. But the reality is you should try and get as many eligible people as possible to be vaccinated.
Okay. Great. I have a question here from Dunia. Is there a possible scenario where we could safely reach herd immunity naturally while protecting vulnerable people with the first available dose of vaccine without a large number of deaths? Michael, would you like to?
Okay, so I mean, let me divide the question into two, if that's okay. The first part is, can we reach herd immunity alone? The answer is no. I think it's not possible. Let me share with you. I did a back of the envelope calculation on the country I live in, which is Israel, which is interesting because up to a few weeks ago, Israel had the very unenviable title of having the highest incidence in the world. Nothing to be proud of. But the interesting thing is, despite that, despite having the most transmission of any country in the world, after 9 months of outbreak, less than 10% of the population had been infected. The National Seroprevalence Study put it at 5.5. I think the reality is probably more around 8, but you can see that that's very, very far from herd immunity. And so you then have two choices. You either and this was an incidence which really brings the healthcare system at a breaking point. If you go faster, the healthcare system gets overwhelmed, and then mortality shoots up, not just from COVID, but from people not being able to get a hospital bed. So that's really not an option. And if you keep it steady, which is a very uncomfortable incidence, by the way, where most things have to be closed, it will take about 10 years. So really, it's not an option. I think the second part of the question is, can we combine herd immunity with vaccination? It's really, you would go vaccinating everyone, providing you have a safe and effective vaccine. In practice, you're going to have limited supplies of vaccines. So there's going to have to be priority groups. And in fact, the UK, the Joint Committee for Vaccination and Immunisation has already specified what groups it will begin with in terms of vaccination. And it is those who are most vulnerable: older individuals, people who are immunosuppressed, high-risk individuals, whereas the others will have to wait, probably. So in practice, that's exactly what's going to happen. It doesn't mean, though, that those who are, it doesn't mean that other measures like social distancing, contact tracing, testing are going to stop once the vaccine is introduced. What you're going to see is you're going to see a relatively long period of time where the vaccine gets introduced gradually to more and more individuals while other measures continue in all segments of the population. I think that one of the issues with COVID is you can always, you can stratify people into risk groups, and older people are clearly more at risk. But there's a very substantial and not insignificant amount of individuals who do not fit into these risk groups, are not old, don't have comorbidities, but unfortunately develop very severe disease and die. So I think the idea that you can safely let the disease transmit once older people are protected and vaccinated is a very risky strategy to take, and I think you'll have to continue with other control measures very similar to what we're seeing now.
Thanks, Michael. Eleni,
can I also add
Yeah.
to this complexity slightly, and taking the example of measles that Michael used? One other issue is that we are extrapolating in terms of what will happen in terms of the longevity of the immune response from human seasonal coronaviruses for SARS-CoV-2. That's an extrapolation, of course, as close as we can get at the moment. But one factor, here is there are infections that where you get the natural infection and you're not getting the infection back again, like measles, where the vaccine obviously is mimicking this natural infection response, so and is highly effective in that respect. Obviously, if the scenario we're extrapolating from seasonal coronaviruses is true here, we don't expect that vaccines also will produce the same immunity that will be for lifetime or for a very long time higher than what is produced by the natural immunity. If that is going to happen, as far as I know, it's going to be a first, where a vaccine is even better, than the natural infection, the natural immune response. So that is a key thing to remember. And the other thing, as Michael alluded to, is behaviors. So when we're talking about herd immunity, one factor is also the behaviors and what affects, and Michael is best obviously to comment on this in terms of this famous or infamous reproductive number. It also depends on the behaviors and the measures that we take at a population level. So that is another extra factor that will influence what we see in terms of herd immunity.
Yeah, of course.
If I may add, because I think this is a very important point. Sorry, I know you
Sure.
want to go through a lot of questions, but it's very interesting.
That's fine, go.
Eleni raised a very important point, which is, and something that is often misunderstood about the R naught that everyone has become an expert in now, or at least everyone on social media. The idea of an R naught relies on the assumption that transmission is homogeneous in a population, meaning that each individual is equally at risk of being infected and infecting others, which of course we know is not true. And in the COVID-19 pandemic, what we're seeing is actually something called the K number, which is the measure of spread of the R naught, which means that actually each infected individual is not as likely to infect others. And what you see is the pandemic being driven by a small number of individuals infecting a lot of people. And at the moment, there's different categories for, people call them super spreaders. I don't really like the term, because it's the reason why this happens is very complex, but it's partly or largely behavioral. So the idea that vaccinating older people and therefore protecting the vulnerable, giving a license for those who are less vulnerable to basically behave, as they wish, is actually quite dangerous as a misconception, because that, I think what we'll see if that happens is an increase in the number of super spreading events, and that's what we saw often post lockdown in a lot of countries, including Israel, where overnight you saw massive parties with thousands of people, which led to further events and large changes of transmission. And these are largely actually the driving stratum of society now is younger people, adolescents, young adults. So yeah, that's a real risk.
Yeah. Around vaccination, the next question I have is from Bill. He's talking about the Pfizer vaccination and the trials showing 95% effectiveness. Bill asks, this 95% of effectiveness is based on a sample of 170 patients. How much should we read into this percentage? Do you have any information about potential confounding factors that could affect this percentage? Michael?
I'll take that. I'm sure Lenny will have a lot to say. So I've been asked a lot about the efficacy of the vaccine, and I want to be cautiously optimistic for several reasons. I think Bill's absolutely right. The numbers are small. You have to remember these are very large trials. There's 30,000 people in the Pfizer trial, 20,000 in the Moderna, or vice versa. And these are interim results based on a relatively small number of a small subset of these patients. That's the first thing. The second thing is, these figures have been published left, right, and center. No one's seen the data. The data's not been, the studies have not been published yet. There's no confidence intervals. There's no indication. I mean, I don't have any, I'm not privy to anything confidential, and if I was, I probably wouldn't share it on a call like this. But I'm confident that, considering what's at stake, the the design of the trials and the regulatory scrutiny is going to be very high. So I'm not really concerned about the design of the trial. I'm sure, you know, confounding and bias has been taken into, I mean, I would hope that has been taken into account. But I'm a little bit concerned about the lack of transparency. It's, in a sense, it's almost too good to be true. So, you know, I am optimistic, and the fact that there's more than one, you know, more than one manufacturer that's seeing really good results. And by the way, based on even less data, the Russian vaccine also seems to have very good results. I think, you know, there's inherent or the automatic reflex is to be suspicious, but, you know, Russia does have the capacity to produce vaccines, so it's not something to completely disregard. And I think, you know, India's also, I mean, there's a lot of different vaccines. They all seem to come with good results. But I would wait and see the full data before jumping to the ceiling. The second thing to say is there's a difference between efficacy and effectiveness, and this is efficacy. You know, this is what you get in controlled, almost, you know, in a trial environment, which is like a lab environment. It's not real life. In real life, people forget to take their doses, the cold chain breaks down, etc., etc. So so the real life effectiveness is always going to be a little bit lower, but nevertheless, it's very encouraging. I don't know, Len, if you want to add anything.
Yes, I would start that. I mean, this is positive, obviously, and we shouldn't disregard that. I mean, it's a positive result, isn't it, to be in such a place here now to discuss so many different strategies to vaccination as well. One that is missing that I would like to talk about in the end, I think is also important, at the moment at least, it's missing. It's a very important place to be, to have so many different approaches. Basically, we have the RNA vaccines, the adenovirus vector vaccines, inactivated vaccines that China also have trialed and are actually using. And they all seem to produce antibodies. That's the first thing. We have the 2 RNA vaccines also giving us some efficacy data. Yes, they're very limited, but they're positive, and they're also very limited in terms of duration of protection. And I think that's really critical here in terms of designing sequential vaccination campaigns and even talking and coming to that herd immunity, you know, effect. I think that will be very important, the duration of the protection for all vaccine candidates. But yes, certainly it is positive. And as Michael said, the devil is in the detail and will be in the detail, also in comparing the different vaccination strategies and actually deciding on the sequential and consecutive vaccine. What will be the combination, for example, or do we have to use combination? For example, a vaccine with a monoclonal, or, you know, consecutive vaccinations, or what would be the best strategy? So I think it will be a very interesting data set also to look in comparison. And of course, another issue is safety, obviously, because a huge issue, because we're talking about millions and billions of people getting vaccinated at the same time, and huge young populations. So I think, yes, positive, but we need to see obviously more. One approach that I wanted to mention that we're also exploring here at UCL is, and I think preliminary data from the US looking at antibody responses would be in favor of that approach, is actually a vaccine that acts on the mucosal immunity and may be delivered either intranasally or sublingually. So I think that's another approach that I hope will be taken up as a serious effort.
Great, thanks for sharing that, Eleni. The next question I have is from Paulina, and she asks, is it possible to reach herd immunity with a virus that doesn't provide long-term immunity? I don't know which one of you want to take that one first.
I can take that quickly. I think the duration of protection, as Eleni alluded to, is one of the key questions, both in terms of the natural immunity, the natural infection, and the vaccine. At the moment, we simply don't know how long you're protected if you're infected. I think there's also a little bit of misunderstanding here, because clearly you see a decay in circulating spike antibodies 3 to 5 months following natural infection. That doesn't necessarily mean that you're losing immunity, but it is it is something to take into consideration. We don't really know how the vaccine is going to work. Is it going, and what type of immune response it will trigger, whether it's going to be, B cell, T cells, etc., etc. From what we do know from other coronaviruses, it seems that lifetime protection, like you're seeing with measles, for example, or hepatitis A, is unlikely, and we're probably going to need repeated vaccination every, I don't know, year, few years, but we don't have the benefit of hindsight, so we actually don't know. If can you reach herd immunity if immunity wanes? It's a complicated question, because what you need is with a schedule that enables revaccination, then at any point in time, yes, you can have enough people being vaccinated to prevent further outbreaks, but it does require achieving high vaccine coverage year after year, a little bit like you're seeing with influenza. It's obviously a much harder challenge that if a single dose or a single course provides lifelong immunity. So yeah, it would be, and it's likely to be a challenge.
Great, thank you.
Can I say, Mike? I think that what will be interesting here is there a point where X number of vaccinated individuals in a population allows you to alter behaviors? I think that will be an interest. I mean, how do you model that in terms of the the population that you vaccinate, and the behavioral changes that you have to implement, and the trade-off there. I think that would be interesting. And something else to say here, that even with infections like measles, where we know we have a good effective vaccine, we still have pockets, obviously, of, especially in London, and especially where I live in North London, either because people don't want to be vaccinated, don't believe in vaccination, might get vaccine or COVID fatigue in the years to come.
Yeah.
And we will still have pockets, obviously, of where outbreaks are possible.
Yeah.
So that's another issue in terms of that herd immunity, achieving it.
Thanks, Eleni. The next question is from DeLuca. So DeLuca asks, do you think various mandatory vaccination programs in Southeast Asian countries, for example, BCG, play a role in relatively low COVID-related mortality rates in those countries? Would either of you like to take this question?
I know that there's. Oh, sorry, Eleni, you wanted to go first, maybe, or?
No, that's okay. I think that was a hypothesis, isn't it? That was refuted in the early, isn't it?
There's quite a few. There's quite a few vaccines that were. There were hypotheses that BCG protected against COVID, that the MMR protected against COVID. I think that some countries have mandatory policies, some don't. But a lot of non, Sweden, for example, has 98% vaccine coverage without having a mandatory policy. That hasn't prevented them from having 10 times the number of cases or the incidents than their neighbors. So I don't know. I couldn't tell you whether BCG vaccination or MMR vaccination protects against COVID, but if it has an effect, it's a relatively minor one, because we haven't seen a clear relationship between vaccine coverage in countries and COVID incidence.
Okay, Interesting. Thanks, Michael. I'm going to ask one more vaccine-related question, and this is from Alyssa, who asks, how much do we know about the immune response elicited by mRNA-based vaccines, such as Pfizer and Moderna, since this is not used in any currently approved vaccines?
Eleni, you want to go, or should I?
Yeah, I mean, either way is fine.
Please.
Yeah, no, it's fine. It's well, we don't. I mean, it's the first time that we're using these vaccines, and I think that will be a very interesting issue in the data. The expectation, obviously, is that an RNA vaccine will elicit more robust T cell responses as well as the B cell compartment. But that's something, you know, we need to wait and see, obviously.
Great, thanks, Eleni. Do you have anything to add, Michael?
No, only that, you know, yes, it's new vaccines, and all we have is, you know, the phase 1 trials for the Moderna vaccine and for the Pfizer vaccine show a pretty good immunogenicity. So there's at this stage, there's no reason to believe that you know that they're not going to be immunogenic, and we're starting to see the data. But obviously, we know nothing about whether long term using mRNA as a platform rather than inactivated viruses makes any difference. I guess we'll just have to collect data and analyze it.
Great, thank you both for those answers. I wanted to move on to some more of the behavioural questions and lessons from other pandemics. So, Eleni, I have a question for you. Study among healthcare workers at UCLH. I wanted to ask what are some of the things that have been learnt from this study in terms of transmission and immunity between healthcare workers, if you're able to share. You're just on mute, Eleni.
We reported the first month of our observations in the SAFER study, which was early in the pandemic in London. And what we reported actually was quite a high seroprevalence in the population of frontline healthcare workers. And clearly, also in our clinical data, we saw that you know, the effect of the lockdown and the lag of time in terms of the incidence of the infections that we saw. So there's clearly a late effect because I think we can all say that the lockdown in London came rather late in the pandemic, and of course the policy in PPE. Initially, you know, there were some changes in terms of policy and, you know, what was used in the acute trusts in the UK. So we did indeed see increased and really high prevalence of the infection early on. We are now analyzing the 3 months data, so, you know, I don't know yet the results, and we will see the trajectory of the antibody responses. But as Michael says, we have seen from other reports that, you know, the antibody titers and the neutralization even titers are falling over time without necessarily meaning that individuals are not protected. So we will have to do a lot more work on that, hopefully also within SAFER, both on B cell and T cell immunity over time. And we're looking at the next year and looking at the rate of reinfection also at the national level in the UK. So I think that will be interesting as well.
Great, thanks for sharing. My next question is around how the UK and Europe compared to Asia, so that although the first known outbreaks were in China, much of Asia seemed to have very low cases of COVID being reported today, compared to Europe, including the UK and America, that still have quite high case numbers. Can you explain why this might be? Are there particular policies that you've seen work quite well over there, or healthcare interventions that you've seen work quite well that maybe haven't been implemented here or haven't worked as well here? Eleni?
I think there have been many commentaries and views on that, isn't it? And I think I tend to say I think the ambivalence sometimes that we had in our response in countries like the UK, for example, compared to Asia, where I guess they were the mindset, and as a society and infrastructure, they were more ready, for something like that. They took the measures in a lot of countries in Southeast Asia immediately in terms of isolation, PPE, and contact tracing and test and trace policies. So I think that is a real difference. And I think it comes down to that, how prepared people were, and what was the thinking about the pandemic and the impact that it might have.
Yeah.
Great.
If I may add to that,
Of course.
I mean, it basically, I completely agree. I think it comes down to preparedness and implementation. You have to remember that Southeast Asia had a SARS outbreak in 2003, and South Korea had a very large MERS cluster in 2013. So they've learned from those lessons, and there's no magic formula. Basically controlling outbreaks. There's steps that have been used for decades, if not longer. And as Eleni said, it's identification of cases, tracing of contacts, social isolation, and basically using the experience of those previous outbreaks. That those plans were in place and were implemented immediately with, large-scale testing taking place in Singapore and South Korea at the same time that the UK government decided that they're actually basically abandoning testing in the community in the UK. So I think, I don't think there's anything magic about it. It's just implementing the basics. One thing that has been talked about, and I don't know what role it's had, is the use of masks, because using masks in Southeast Asia is very common, and was common before the outbreak, whereas masks were not recommended in most of Europe until pretty recently, until quite far into the outbreak. And actually the WHO was saying the evidence is not clear, and then there was a complete switch at some point. So whether that made a change, that had an impact, I don't know. One thing that is clear is that you're looking at outbreak, the growth of outbreaks is exponential. So at what point in time you act makes a massive difference. So very early intervention, it's like a tanker, like a 1 degree change further down the line, you end up in completely different places. And in a sense, that's what happened. You had very early and extensive intervention in with very high, very widespread testing, social distancing, masks, contact tracing very early on, which meant that if you look at the curves, the cumulative incidence curves, it's very clear. You have two groups. You have Europe going up because they did nothing early on, or virtually nothing. And once you realize that you need to do something, in a sense, it's too late, because the number of cases exceeds the capacity to test and contact trace, whereas in many Asian countries, the needs never exceeded the capacity. So yeah, I think that's largely what happened.
Great, thank you, Michael, for sharing. So we have time for one more question probably, and I wanted to ask both of you if there's one key learning from the pandemic, or one key thing you'd like everyone in this discussion to take away from this discussion, what would that be?
Yeah, I just wanted to maybe close with, and from the last point that Michael made, I think for me it's also about shared learning and being open to the experiences of others. For example, this ambivalence that I felt existed, and Michael describing the timing of the response, in Europe versus Southeast Asia, for example. I think the other thing that I experienced here was there was as if there was a need for us to confirm and reconfirm what was experienced in other countries, for example, and what people were reporting and what they were seeing in Southeast Asia. And actually, for us to take measures, we actually wanted to have the evidence that it is so. If I'm not sure if I'm expressing it right, but so I think being open to that and sharing the learning and the experience, I think, is key in something like that involves, obviously, that is global. And for me, that is the most important message
of course. Especially when other countries have witnessed outbreaks like this before. Michael, would you like to?
Yeah, I'm going to have two, but they're connected, so I think I can get away with it. I think one thing we did wrong in this outbreak is, at least in Europe, is we forgot the basics. We forgot the basics of outbreak management, and in Southeast Asia didn't forget them. And there was this idea early on that that technology was going to have a major role, that we're going to be able to identify all cases using apps, etc., which is fine and important to explore, but it was done at the expense of investing in traditional outbreak control, and I think that was a major mistake. We didn't invest in contact tracing, we didn't invest in testing. We just invested into technology, and that proved not to work. So I think that the key lesson is to be a little bit careful about assuming that technology always is a solution, always solves the problems that you have. When you're dealing with uncertainty and you have approaches that work, maybe that's the first port of call, and maybe you invest in that, and then in parallel you look at the role. And what I'm seeing, after many years in this field, is I think traditional epidemiology, traditional outbreak control still has a bright future, and technology and technological tool and innovations are only going to supplement this, not replace it. And I think that's how we should think about innovation in this space, which is unfortunately, especially in the UK, has not been the case, and that has translated into lives lost.
Yeah. Thank you so much to both of you for those key learnings and for sharing all your knowledge today around vaccines, and particularly your positivity around the new vaccine, and hopefully the points you made about the rollout will be taken into consideration. But that's all we have time for today. I have so many more questions I could ask, but we're out of time. So thank you so much to both of you for joining. It's been really interesting, and I hope to speak to both of you soon. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks a lot. Thanks, Erin.
Thanks, Michael. Thanks, Elaine.
Thank you.
Bye.